Well, take your Bible and 2 Samuel 18, and I thought about how to finish out this year, and uh, and I do appreciate uh, Scott's comment. Just to let you know, as I do the daily devotionals, that it does take me about 4 hours per devotional to pull it all together and to edit it. And usually, my wife's editing it about late in the evening sometimes, much to her chagrin that I'm running late. But with that, and speaking of Sunday school, and speaking of Sunday morning, and speaking on Wednesday night and then writing devotions 7 days a week. I kind of got my hands full right now, but anyway, so I wanted to go back. I thought it would be good, particularly this class and my Wednesday night class. We have gone through the life of David, and as we come to the morning service, we'll be looking at 2 Samuel 22. 2 Samuel 22 happens to be his doxology. It's his last song, as far as we know, the last song that would have come from his lips, and he might have very well have been on the deathbed at that time. There will be something that happens after that, and that is that another son named Ahithophel decides, "Dad's dying, I'm going to be king," and he usurped the throne. At least he tried to, and David intervened before he died. He took the crown off of his head and he put it on his son's head. Who was that son? Solomon. He put it on Solomon's head. So there would be no doubt what his will was. It was not that Ahithophel would be king, it was that Solomon, the youngest son, would be king. And Solomon probably would have been maybe late teens, early 20s at the very max, David being 70 years old when he died. So, and you look at the scriptures and it says at 70 years old, he was old and frail. And I'm thinking, now, wait a minute. Some of us, I'm not at 70, and some of you are beyond 70. And other than sometimes getting weary with all the work, I still feel blessed. I have a lot of energy, so much so that my wife finds it hard to live with me sometimes. Anyway, setting that aside, let's look through this. And a lot of the verses are going to be on there. Some of them are not going to be. But I wanted to walk you through this history. Now, we are going to look at Absalom's death, and obviously this is a critical moment in David's life. But before I do that, let me back up. All of the troubles that have come on David and Israel trace all the way back to his sin with Bathsheba and the murder of her husband Uriah. You might remember the prophet Nathan came to David and said to him, "The sword will never depart from your house." And so the meaning of that is not only would there be a death that would be a constant shadow of his life, but for him, it would be constant sorrow. And, if we have children that are not a sorrow to us, we are indeed very blessed. But living in the world that we live in today, it's not unusual to grow old and yet have children who are a sorrow. That's another whole story. But the fact is, for David, even at the time of his death, he had a son who was usurping the throne, trying to take it before he was dead. Kind of reminds me, many years ago, a man in the church had died, and I go by, Sheila and I, to visit his widow. Now, his widow had married late in life, probably in her 50s, married the man who had died. She was the second husband. He had, or the second wife, his first wife having died young. So I go by the house to visit, and I walk in. I'm expecting all the family to be there, right? Dad's dead. They just wheeled his body out. And I thought for sure the sons would be there and be there with this widow lady that was her stepmother. And so I go in and I greet her, and it's like, "Where are the sons?" And she says, "Oh, well, they wanted the key to the safety deposit box." Oh, okay. Well, sadly, they wiped her out. what is it? Bonds, the bonds, carrier bonds, or so, what are those bonds? Bearer bonds. Yeah, they wiped her out. It was all in there. She ended up living and dying in a little cold um, nursing home. Not even a nursing home. It was really bad. Not all of it's bad, but there's a particular home in the area that they have a lot of trailers in, and those are generally pretty nice. But then they have also a place for advanced care, basically near death. And I went. Remember after that, I went by to visit her, and her room was ice cold. It was like this time of year, and I knocked on her door, and I went in. Now, don't think about the fancy nursing homes. Think about almost a closet, kind of that type of room. And I remember knocking on the door, and I went in, and she's in there, and she's doing like that. And I said, "Why isn't your heat on?" And she says, "I told them, and hadn't turned it on." Well, she died not long after that. My point in this is this matter in our culture today of kids waiting for mom and dad to die so they can get the inheritance. It's not new. It goes all the way back through the history of man. So here we pick it up here. Absalom's death, and hopefully I'll get most of what's on the outline there. But David has an ill-advised directive. Absalom has led an insurrection. David has fled across the Jordan River. He is staying at a place, Mahanaim, a city on the east side of the Jordan. And his army and the army of Absalom, most of Israel, are preparing to go to war. David's final command to his army is verse 5 of chapter 18. And the king commanded Joab and Abishai, the captains of his army, and Ittai, saying, "Deal gently for my sake with the young man, even with Absalom, the rebel, the insurrectionist, the one whose insurrection will cost 20,000 lives before the day is over." And David's final command to his soldiers was, "Be gentle with Absalom." And we read, "And all the people heard when the king gave all the captains charge concerning Absalom." Here's a question for you. Is it possible as you get older to improperly deal gently with a rebellious son or daughter? Is that possible? Yeah. You know why? A lot of it is driven by guilt. I wasn't a good father. I wasn't a good mother. I wish I had been this, and I wish I had been that. But I think as parents, we tend to take more responsibility for the decisions of our children than we ought to take. Because children, by their nature, are more than willing to dump on mom and dad the responsibility for their own sinful decisions. Do you understand that? I've met people in their 80s that are blaming mom and dad. Mom and dad have been in the grave 30 years. Are you kidding me? You're in your mess because you put yourself in that mess. Our children make life decisions, and they ought to bear the consequences of those decisions. But too often, parents rush in and they try to spare their children the weight of those decisions. And so here we come back to Absalom, the final command to an army that is going to the battlefield, and they're going to risk their lives for David. The final command is, "Be gentle with Absalom." You think that's crazy? It is. These men are going to risk everything for you, and you're worried about sparing the rebel. We can have misplaced affection, right? Let me move on. Israel's civil war. I won't go through all this, but the battle was in a place called the Wood of Ephraim. Now, the woods apparently were very thick back then, very rough, very rugged. And so in the providence of God, the battle, instead of taking place on a battlefield like an Armageddon, which I've looked on, below Mount Carmel. Instead, it's taking place in the woods. And so you can imagine fighting in the woods. I sometimes look at some of the history of Great Britain, England fighting the Americans. Well, the Americans learned early on, for the most part, many of them, to fight like the Indians, the Native Americans, right? Hide behind the trees, back up, ambush, all that. Well, the crazy English redcoats, what would they do? They would march like toy soldiers into the battle, cannons booming, guns, muskets firing. I've often thought, I'm not sure what I would have done at that time. I guess if you're in the army, you're going to march right into the fight of it. But a lot of it just doesn't make a lot of sense. Would you agree? Some of you are military. Makes no sense. They're shooting a cannon at me, and I'm marching toward them. That's not going to be a good ending. Well, for Absalom's army, they ended up, he had the larger army, and David's army that went forth without him, by the way, had the smaller army. But the advantage was to David's army. Many of his army were from the east side of the Jordan River. Most of Absalom's army were from the west side of the Jordan River. So when they got over into the forest, it did not go well that day. And you can read, there was a great slaughter that day of 20,000 men. And here's what is really interesting, verse 8. For the battle was there scattered over the face of all the country, and the forest, devoured more people that day than the sword devoured. That is God's intervention, isn't it? That God, by nature, took down more lives that day than David's army was able to kill. Now, moving on. The slaying of Absalom, and again, I'm just reviewing a history of this. Absalom flees the battlefield, and we find him hanging in a tree. And I told the Wednesday night class, a lot of the childhood stories about Absalom being killed have him hanging by his hair in the tree. But that's not what the Bible says. The Bible says nothing about his hair. The Bible does say, though, that he was hanging in a tree. In fact, this is what it said. Absalom met the servants of David, and Absalom rode upon a mule, and the mule went under the thick boughs of a great oak, and not his hair, but his head caught hold of the oak. And he was taken up between the heaven and the earth, and the mule that was under him went away. And I think what happened for Absalom was his head got caught in the fork of a tree, like in the limbs, right? And it got caught in that. The mule keeps going. He's left hanging there. And I think he was probably paralyzed. And the reason is he continued to hang there until he was found. And so I think perhaps he was not dead, but he was hanging in that tree, perhaps with a neck that was broken. I'm going to keep going. And so a soldier comes and he tells Captain Joab that I saw Absalom. He is hanging in the tree. And Joab says, well, why didn't you kill him? And the soldier reminded reminded Joab, I heard what David told you. And he said to deal gently with Absalom. And Joab says, listen, I would have given you 10 pieces of silver if you had killed Absalom. And the soldier says, you could have given me 1,000 pieces of silver, and I wasn't going to kill Absalom, the son of David. And then he went a little bit further. I'm going to just go through this. He went a little bit further. And the soldier said, and if I had have killed Absalom, I know what you would have done to me. You would have killed me and told David one of the soldiers killed Absalom. So it was very interesting. Well, Joab dropped the complaint against the soldier. He goes out. He finds Absalom, the son of David, hanging in the tree, still alive. And the Bible says that he threw darts into his heart. Now, the darts would have been like short spears, heavy on the end, like probably bigger than an arrow, heavier than an arrow. So he thrust them into Absalom, and he killed him. And then adding to the humiliation of Absalom in verse 15, 10 young men brought him down from the tree and they beat his dead body until they finally buried him. And they buried him in an unmarked grave in a ravine. They piled stones over it. I won't go into any more of it, but it is interesting that Absalom had raised a pillar to himself as a memorial to Absalom, the great son of David. And I think the soldiers determined, we're not going to let him have any memorial. We're going to bury him in disgrace. And so they did. They piled rocks over his body. I'm going to keep going. I hope you don't mind. Two messengers wanted to bring news to David of the victory. And I'm not going to walk through this. But David is waiting outside the city wall for news of how the victory has gone. He knew that the army of Israel was far superior to his, and it could have been, without God's intervention, that Absalom would have won the day, and he would have come to kill his father and then secure the throne of Israel. Well, two messengers brought news of the victory to David. Ahimaaz was the anxious messenger. You met him before if you've studied the scripture. He was the son of a priest, and he was the one that brought news from Jerusalem to David when David was fleeing of what Absalom was doing in the city. And it was this man here, Ahimaaz. And then there's Cushai, the chosen messenger. Cushai is not a Hebrew name. It's actually an African name. And so somehow this Cushai ends up being the chosen messenger. So Joab says, no, Ahimaaz, you're not going to tell the king. I'm going to choose Cushai. And when I originally taught it, I wondered, why in the world didn't David choose the son of the priest? I mean, surely that would have been the choice. And as I thought more about it, I thought, I think it might have been in Joab's or David's anger and sorrow and grief. He might have risen up and killed the messenger, right? Messenger comes with bad news, kill the messenger. Kind of like what it is to be a preacher sometimes. I'm moving on. Thought I'd just zing that one in there. All right, moving on. Anyway, David has a watchman up on the wall at the tower of the gate, and he calls down and he says, I see a messenger. And he's coming. And then the watchman calls down again, and he says, I see a second messenger coming. And the one that's coming the fastest, it looks like Ahimaaz must have been known for being a fast runner. And so he brings news, and it was the news of the victory. That David, the day has been won. But David's question was regarding all of this was not, how many men did we lose, or what was the war, what was the battle like? Instead, it was just the opposite. David wants to know, what about my son Absalom? So here's the question. 2 Samuel 18 and verse 32. And the king said unto Cushai, is the young man Absalom safe? You see, David only cared about one thing, and it was Absalom. And I think a lot of that was driven by his guilt. His sin of adultery with Bathsheba, the murder of Uriah the Hittite. He was very much mindful that everything that was happening was fulfilling the prophecy of Nathan, who said, the sword will never depart from your house. And so David's waiting, and he hears the news. They've won the day. But his question is, what about my son Absalom? And Cushai is a great politician. He says, enemies of my lord the king and all that rise against thee to do thee hurt, thee is that young man. In other words, he's dead. Well, then some other thoughts that go through this. David's inconsolable sorrow. And I mentioned to you earlier the missionary whose son had passed away. And I don't think, unless we've lost a child, I don't think any of us can fully identify with David's sorrow. He was overwhelmed with sorrow. In fact, so much that he retreated from the gate and his obligation as a king. His obligation was to greet the warriors, the army. It's coming home victorious, to greet them and to thank them. But instead, he retreats from any contact with anyone. And we read in verse 33, and the king was much moved, and he went up to the chamber over the gate, and he wept. And now look at his words. "O my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would God I had died for thee, O Absalom, my son, my son." That's a pretty moving moment if you think about it, because what David is saying, I would rather be dead and you alive than I would to be alive and to know my son is dead. Of course, you can think about the consequences for Israel. Had Absalom won the day, David would be dead, and they would have a wicked king, the son of the king, ruling over them. And then David reproached himself. We've already seen that. I'm going to keep moving. Would God I had died for thee. And then David's regret troubled the faithful. So the soldiers start leaving the battlefield, and they're coming to Mahanaim. And David is not there to greet them. And so we read in chapter 19, it was told Joab, "Behold, the king weepeth, and he mourneth for Absalom." And we could go on, but look at verse 3, the effect of David not being there to greet the people, and instead mourning the death of the rebel. And then at verse 3, "And the people gat them by stealth that day secretly." They almost humiliated, as people being ashamed steal away when they flee in battle. In other words, David's grief robbed the people of the joy of the victory. So they were overwhelmed. So what does Joab do? He learns about David crying, "My son, my son." And Joab comes to David, the king, and he says to David, "This is what you're doing." So let me read. 2 Samuel 19:1, "And it was told Joab, Behold, the king weepeth, and he mourneth for Absalom." So Joab, the captain of the army, goes to David, and he confronts him about the effect that his mourning is having on the people. In fact, so much so that Joab says in verse 5, "Thou hast shamed this day the faces of all thy servants." And he counts off, "This day, which this day have saved thy life, the lives of thy sons, thy daughters, the lives of thy wives, and the lives of thy concubines." So what Joab did was give David a different perception. In David's grief, he was focused on himself. And he did not realize and take note of the fact that if Absalom had lived, that not only would David, but everybody associated with David's family would have been slain. And you know, typically in history, when there is a usurper to a throne, that usurper, the new king, he will kill anybody that has any right of inheritance to the throne. So Joab says, "Listen, because we've won the day, your children, your sons, your wives, your concubines have all been spared because we've won the day." Then the accusation, "In that thou lovest thine enemies and hatest thy friends." These are pretty strong words, aren't they? This is a strong rebuke. And I could go on through that, but I want to move on through this quickly. Verse 7, "Now therefore Joab says to David, Arise, go forth, speak comfortably unto thy servants, for I swear by the Lord, if you don't," here's what we're going to read, "there will not tarry one with thee this night, and that will be worse unto thee than all the evil that befell thee from thy youth until now." If you don't go and welcome the army, if you continue to grieve and cause sorrow and humiliation on your faithful soldiers, there won't be one man left who will stand beside you tonight. So, a pretty great confrontation, right? You know, sometimes it's good to have a reality check in life. For us men, your wives probably are more than willing to give you a reality check. It's good to get a different perspective. Now, I don't know what men here are like, but my wife tends to tell me that I go through life somewhat like that. You know what that means, right? Wearing blinders. Now, having grown up on a farm, and I know about the halters that you put on horses or that you put on mules. They always have blinders, right? And so let's say the mule that's pulling the plow is only focused on where the farmer wants the mule to go, right? And so with the blinders on the eyes on the halter, it keeps the mule or the horse that's plowing, it keeps them from being distracted by other things. So they're only focused on one thing. Now, why or am I going with that? Oh, yeah, perception. Perception. So, my point is this: it's good to hear a different perspective. Agree? It's good to have a reality check, and that would be true of men and women. Moving on. By the way, if you want to ever jump into the deep end of the pool here where I'm swimming, you're more than welcome to do so. Right now, I know this is like plowing through, building a tunnel through a mountain. So I hope I'm not going to lose you. Now, David was persuaded and hearkened to Joab's warning, and he did go down to the gate, and he did begin to greet the soldiers as they passed and to thank them, even in the midst of his grief. Even in the midst of his grief. And I'm going to jump ahead with this. There's this whole scene that follows this about David waiting to be invited back to Jerusalem. Now remember, he ran from Jerusalem during the insurrection because all of the Israel supported Absalom. They actually rejected the man after God's heart to support a rebel. And by the way, he had been Absalom was quite a politician. He had flirted with Israel's people for years. In fact, at one point of the scripture says that Absalom himself would go and sit at the gate, and he would greet people who were coming to the gate with grievances. And they wanted to be heard by the king, by a judicial official. And Absalom would say, the king doesn't have time for you. He's got somebody else. He's busy with other things. Oh, that if I were king. And he did that long enough that the people actually turned their affection from David and they embraced Absalom, this wicked insurrectionist. That brings me back to this. David waited for the children of Israel to say, David, please come back to rule. And so he waited, and he waited. And they did come back. He received the invitation, and David crossed over. But the one invitation he hadn't received was from Judah. Judah had not come at first to greet him. Now, David was of the tribe of Judah. So he's waiting to be invited. David extended an offer of peace to Israel and the men of Judah. Basically, I will show you grace in spite of the rebellion. Thirdly, understanding David was returning to the throne, some men were anxious to meet David and make peace with him. I wish I had time to teach that. I don't. Any of you remember the name Shimei? Remember Shimei? Shimei was the guy that was throwing rocks at David and cursing him when he's fleeing from the city the first time. So guess who was one of the first ones to meet David when he's coming back to Jerusalem? Good old Shimei. He's down there and he's trying to make good with David, and David spares his life. However, after Solomon became king, guess who was one of the first men to be killed? Shimei. So Solomon had a good memory. And I think when David was dying, he probably told his son, here are your enemies, and you ought to get rid of them as soon as you can. So and so he did. There's several others I could give you, but I won't. Israel's quarrel with the men of Judah. I'm not going to spend a lot of time with this other than this. There ends up being a division between the 10 tribes in the north and Judah and the little tribe of Benjamin in the south. And that is that Judah wanted to say, David is our king. Well, Israel, the 10 tribes of the north, said, no, wait a minute. We've got 10 parts of David. He's our king. So you have this conflict between the tribes. And it is the conflict that will ultimately divide the nation later on. That's another whole story, and I won't share it. If you've been following in the devotions, you know all of this, though. I'm going to jump ahead. Reproach of 10 concubines. Do you remember when David fled Israel? He left behind 10 concubines whose responsibility was to do what? to look after the palace. Absalom, though, used the opportunity to shame David. And you might remember, Absalom had meant to put a tent on top of his house, perhaps the very porch that he had watched and observed Bathsheba. And so this tent goes up over the palace so that all Israel could see Absalom go into David's concubines and commit adultery with them. So what David had done with Bathsheba, now Absalom did 10 times worse with the 10 wives of David. And so David, as he comes back, has to deal with those 10 concubines. And so he puts them out of the harem, and they will, for the rest of their life, stay in another house apart from him because of the shame and humiliation that they had suffered because of Absalom. Moving on, there's a guy named Sheba, chapter 20 and verse 1. All's well that ends well. No, not so. A guy named Sheba decided if Absalom could do it, I can do it. So Sheba ends up leading an insurrection himself. Now, the background in the story of Sheba, and I wish I had time to go through it, is that he flees away to a city because he led an insurrection. But the insurrection ended up falling apart as a result. And so he flees to a city, but David determines, I'm going to kill Sheba. And so he chooses Amasa, right here, 2 Samuel 20, verse 4 and 5. He chooses a soldier named Amasa, and he says, you have 3 days to put together an army and go and kill my enemy Sheba. So he was given 3 days. Amasa goes out, but he's unable to gather the army in the 3 days. David knows that time is of the essence. And so as a result, he goes to Abishai, one of the captains of the armies, and he says to him, gather an army and go and pursue Sheba. Now, you probably don't remember this. Amasa was the captain of Absalom's army. All right, when Absalom led the insurrection, it was Amasa who was his captain. But Amasa had been forgiven by David. So here was an opportunity for Amasa to prove his loyalty to David by raising an army and going and killing Sheba. But he failed to do so. As a result of that, Abishai gathers an army and he goes after this Sheba. And on the way, he runs into Joab, captain of the army. Joab is the one that said, I killed Absalom. He's the one that killed Absalom. Now, I'm going to move on. And the mighty men, they went out to Jerusalem to pursue after Sheba. And if you are familiar with this story, maybe from growing up in Sunday school, you would know a little bit about this here. So Joab kills Amasa, who failed to raise an army, and he eliminated his rival. Then he gets to the city. And at the city, he begins to build a ramp to go up to assault the walls of the city where Sheba was staying. Now, this is the rebel. And so he's behind the wall there. I'm going to jump ahead of this here. So much I'm skipping. I wish I had time to go through it. All right. So Sheba failed in the rebellion. He sought asylum in a city. And he's hiding in the city. And there's a woman that leans over the wall and says, Joab, what do you want? You can read the last part of verse 15 of 2 Samuel 20. Joab battered the wall. He's going to throw it down. He is determined he's going to kill Sheba. But there was a woman that leans over the wall and says, what do you want? She intervenes for the city. And she cries, here, 2 Samuel 20, 16. The woman cried out, hear, hear, I pray you unto Jacob, come near hither that I may speak with thee. And she says in verse 17, art thou Jacob? He says, I am he. Then she said unto him, hear the words of thine handmaid. And he answered, I do hear. Then she spake, and then goes through this whole thing about the wisdom of the people living in the city. And why are you wanting to kill our city? Why are you wanting to destroy our city? Well, Joab proposes peace in this, and we read here in 2 Samuel 20 and verse 21, the matter is not so, but a man of Mount Ephraim, Sheba, the son of Bichri by name, hath lifted up his hand against the king, even against David. Deliver him only, and I will depart from the city. And the woman said unto Joab, she must have had a little bit of authority in the city. She says, behold, his head shall be thrown to thee over the wall. I've often thought, what must it have been like to be Sheba, right? You're hunkering down in the city and you're hiding, and you're listening to Joab, and he's calling up, give me Sheba, and he hears his woman's voice that says, give me a few minutes, and I'll give you his head, right? And so she does. She goes in, and they cut off Sheba's head, come up, drop it over the wall. Joab picks the head up, and he goes back to the city. You don't think that the Bible has some interesting stories? It certainly does. Verse 22, then the woman went unto all the people in her wisdom. They cut off the head of Sheba, and son of Bichri, and cast it out to Joab, blew the trumpet, and Joab took the head. All right, I'm going to elect final years. Here we go. I've got, 2 points left. Three things really happened in 2 Samuel 21. The first is 3 years of famine and drought. And David finds out the cause of this famine is that Saul had killed or attacked the Gibeonites. Anybody here remember who the Gibeonites were? Huh? They go back to Joshua. Joshua and Israel had come across. They had crossed into the promised land, and they were waging war. They destroyed the city of Jericho, and they were continuing city by city destroying. Well, the people of Gibeon came down to Israel, and they said, we've come a long ways. Our bread is moldy, our clothes are worn out, our shoes are worn out, and our wine skin bottles, they are cracked and old. And so without praying, the children of Israel said, well, we'll make peace with you. Well, they found out the next day or so that Gibeon was only like the next city over. And so everybody's upset with Joshua because, Joshua, you made peace. We should have destroyed Gibeon, and now look at what we've done. And so Joshua draws up a covenant with Gibeon that for the rest of time, the people of Gibeon would be the servants of Israel. But Saul attacked Gibeon, and he broke the covenant. As a result, God sent 3 years of famine and drought into Israel. And then you can look at the last part of this verse. Why is this happening? And the Lord said, it is for Saul, for his bloody house, because he slew the Gibeonites. A long story, but I'm going to just sum it up. David goes to the Gibeonites. He said, what can I do to get rid of the curse? And they said, give us 7 sons of Saul to kill. 7 sons. So obviously not the sons. It would be the grandsons of Saul. And so David did. He took 7 sons of the lineage of Saul's grandsons, and he turned it over to the Gibeonites. The Gibeonites then turned around. I'm going to jump ahead to my slide here. The Gibeonites then hung them on trees and left them to die there, 7 men. As a result of that, atonement, if you would, Israel was forgiven and God sent rain. Whole story about Rizpah. Anybody know Rizpah? Some of the ladies might. She stayed at the body of her dead sons for weeks, driving away the beast and the vultures from their body. David was so moved by the news that he actually gave Jonathan and Saul and the sons of the household an honorable burial. Man, so much I'm skipping. Oh, last thing, and I'll close because I'm going to do it in the morning service anyway. One of the last things for David, remember, he's close to 70. He's old and he's frail. He doesn't go to war anymore. is that the Philistines once again wage war against Israel. And that all will lead up to our study this morning. Skipping through. Thoughts, questions, comments before I shut up and close up? You go through a whirlwind, right? Did it bring back any memories of things you studied years ago, maybe even as a child? If you came to Christ later in life, you've missed the opportunity of growing up in a children's Sunday school class where there would have been flannel graphs. How many of you went to Sunday school with flannel graphs, right? And you think back, those flannel graphs were very vibrant. And I'm not sure how they would be received in this culture where everything is electronic and digital and everything is moving. But I still can't help but think, stripping away the electronics of the day, that flannel graphs wouldn't grab kids' attention if a good teacher is presenting it. So, anyway, some of what I've taught you today, you would have, if you grew up in a church like Hillsdale, you would have been taught these things in Sunday school by some excellent teachers. Well, that's it.